The desert air was thick with smoke, and the ground below trembled as tanks rolled over scorched earth. The general's voice echoed across the command post, firm and resigned. "It's over. We've lost too much too fast. There's no way back from this." His words were met with silence, an army too weary to protest, too broken to hope. But in the corner of the airfield, where the shadows of abandoned hangars swallowed rusted steel, a man sat quietly, listening. His uniform was faded, his wings long since retired, his name forgotten by most. Captain Elias Ward, once a pilot who carved fear into enemies with the unmistakable growl of his A-10 Thunderbolt II, had been dismissed as a relic of another war. The general's orders meant surrender. But for Elias, surrender had never been an option. His boots echoed against the concrete as he walked toward the hangar, where one lone A-10 sat, stripped of glory, half cannibalized for parts, its gray paint chipped and weary. Mechanics had long abandoned it, convinced it would never fly again. But Elias placed his hand on its cold fuselage as though greeting an old comrade. "They said you were done," he whispered. "But I know better." The radio crackled in the command post as scouts reported enemy armor advancing, hundreds of vehicles cutting through the valley like a steel tide. Panic spread among the ranks, but Elias had already slipped away, climbing into the cockpit with hands that still remembered every switch, every dial. Dust filled the canopy, but when he brought the systems to life, the engines roared awake like a beast stirred from slumber. Soldiers on the ground turned in disbelief as the forgotten A-10 taxied onto the broken runway. The growl of its twin engines was unmistakable, a sound that once meant salvation for those trapped below. Young recruits pointed skyward as if witnessing a ghost rise from the ashes. The general, furious, shouted into the radio. "Ward! What the hell are you doing? That bird is grounded. Stand down, that's an order." But Elias only replied, voice steady. "Not today, General. Not when there's still a fight to be had." The A-10 lifted into the air, straining against gravity, but once airborne, it moved with a deadly grace that belied its battered frame. Below, the battlefield unfolded like a living nightmare. Columns of tanks, artillery pieces, and soldiers pushing relentlessly forward. The enemy believed victory was inevitable. What they had not accounted for was the wrath of a man who refused to die quietly. Elias descended low, the trademark of the Warthog, its wings slicing through smoke. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon thundered, spitting fire that tore into steel. One tank erupted into flames, then another, the ground shaking as explosions rolled through the valley. Soldiers cheered as they watched from the trenches, their despair replaced by roaring hope. Enemy commanders scrambled, confused. Intelligence had told them the A-10s were long gone, their threat erased from the skies. Yet here was one, alive, relentless, and flown by a pilot who fought as though the world itself depended on him. But Elias knew this wasn't just about destruction. He wasn't here to win the war single-handedly. He was here to remind his people that they were not finished, that sometimes one act of defiance was enough to turn the tide. Fuel was limited, ammunition scarcer still, but with every pass he made, he carved a line in history, forcing the enemy to retreat, to reconsider, to fear. The battlefield became a stage for something greater than orders and surrender. It became a testament to defiance. And as he pulled the Warthog up through the smoke, the setting sun glinting off its battered armor, Elias's voice crackled through the radio once more, calm, resolute and unyielding. "This fight isn't over. Not while I'm still in the sky." The radio carried his words across every trench, bunker, and command tent. Soldiers who had moments before been slumped in despair now lifted their heads. The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon was more than just firepower. It was the sound of defiance, of survival, of someone daring to believe that defeat was not destiny. On the ground, men and women scrambled to rearm, to hold their lines, their hearts pounding in rhythm with every burst of Elias's gun runs. The general himself stood frozen in the command post, headset pressed against his ears, torn between fury and awe. 4 years, he had taught discipline, the sanctity of orders, the importance of calculated retreat. But now, watching a single man disobey him and somehow turn despair into fire, the general felt something he had not in months, hope clawing its way back into his chest. Elias kept low, weaving through smoke pillars, each maneuver daring, each attack merciless. His eyes scanned the horizon, calculating threats as naturally as breathing. A convoy of armored vehicles crept through the valley, trying to flank the trenches. Elias banked sharply, descended so low that dirt and sand whipped up behind him, and unleashed the Avenger cannon. The lead vehicle exploded in a blaze, shrapnel tearing through the line behind it. Soldiers below erupted into cheers, fists pumping the air, the sound drowned by the roar of the engines. Inside the cockpit, Elias was calm, almost eerily so. Every gauge told him the truth. His bird was old, her systems strained, fuel bleeding faster than he'd like. But he didn't care. He wasn't flying for numbers, nor for approval. He was flying for the faces below, for the belief that they still mattered. A missile warning screamed suddenly across his panel. Heat seekers locked onto his tail. Elias slammed the throttle forward, maneuvering into a brutal climb, the G-forces pressing his body into the seat. He deployed flares, streaks of fire dancing in the sky, fooling the missile as it veered off into the void. For a moment, silence reigned in his headset, the battlefield watching breathless as he vanished into the clouds. Then his voice came back, steady as ever. "Still with you." The relief that surged across the comms was electric. Even the general found himself muttering, almost involuntarily, "Damn you, Ward! Keep flying!" Enemy forces scrambled to adapt, their anti-air units pivoting, hunting the lone intruder. Elias, however, anticipated them. His years of combat weren't just etched in metals, they were seared into instinct. He swept low again, hugging the ridges, appearing from angles they never expected. Artillery positions hidden in the hills erupted under his fire. A supply truck convoy lit the night as he strafed its fuel tanks, turning the valley into a river of fire. The enemy faltered, their advance stalling. What had been a march of inevitability turned into chaos. They had prepared for a broken army, an easy victory, not for the resurrection of a ghost in the sky. Fear replaced arrogance, and confusion rippled through their ranks. But with every victory came cost. Inside the cockpit, Elias could feel the shudder of his A-10, the frame straining against punishment. Warning lights blinked, fuel reserves dangerously low. He ignored them all. His hands were steady, his breathing measured. He thought not of survival, but of buying every second he could for those below. A young soldier on the ground, helmet tilted back, whispered to his comrade as tracer rounds lit the sky, "That's no man, that's a legend." And perhaps in that moment, Elias became exactly that. The general finally broke his silence on the command channel. His voice was no longer the weary tone of a man resigned to loss. It was sharp, commanding, alive again. "All units. Regroup. Push forward. Ward is opening the sky for us. Take the ground." The battlefield shifted like a great beast waking from slumber. Soldiers surged with newfound fury, counterattacking with the sound of the A-10 as their war drum. Where there had been retreat, now there was advance. Where there had been despair, now there was fire. Elias watched it unfold from above, eyes narrowing as he spotted another column moving through the canyon, a desperate push from the enemy. He knew the risk, knew his bird could barely handle another run, but his decision was instant. He angled down, engines howling as he dove once more into the storm. Flak peppered the air, bursts of black clouds surrounding him, but he pressed on. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the Avenger roared again, a torrent of shells shredding through armor, metal shrieking as tanks erupted. His plane shook violently, alarms screaming, but Elias held steady, refusing to pull away until the last tank was burning. The strain finally showed. A blast tore near his wing, rattling the entire frame. Warning lights flashed red across his panel, and the engine coughed in protest. Smoke trailed behind the A-10 as Elias pulled up, fighting to keep her aloft. The battlefield below erupted in flames and thunder, the enemy scattering under the fury he unleashed. His breathing grew heavier, the weight of exhaustion settling in, but he forced a grin. He had given them time. He had given them belief. He had turned surrender into defiance. The general's voice broke through once more, urgent but reverent now. "Ward, if you can hear me, you've done more than any of us could ask. Return to base. That's an order." But Elias didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon, the vast desert stretching endlessly, the smoke curling upward in black plumes. He thought of the young faces below, the ones who had looked up at him as if he were more than flesh and blood. He thought of the promise he made long ago, that as long as he could fly, he would never let them fall. His hand tightened on the stick, the Warthog limping but still in the fight, its engines groaning but not yet silent. And then finally, his voice came through, low and resolute, carrying a weight that silenced every soul who heard it. "General, I'll return when the sky is quiet." The desert night bled into a canvas of fire and smoke, the sky lit with tracer rounds and the glow of burning armor. Elias Ward's A-10 limped across the battlefield, battered yet unyielding, its engines groaning with every maneuver. The soldiers on the ground had stopped fighting in silence. Now they roared with each pass of the Warthog, their chants echoing across the valley, their courage reignited by the defiance of one forgotten pilot. The war no longer felt lost. Hope had become tangible, woven into every thunderous burst of the GAU-8. But Elias knew the truth. Every gauge on his console screamed failure. Fuel dangerously low, hydraulics bleeding out, the left engine threatening to seize. He felt the shudder of the aircraft in his bones, as if the Warthog itself whispered that its time was nearly done. Yet even as alarms blared, his grip remained firm. He had been called reckless, stubborn, even suicidal, but tonight none of that mattered. Tonight, he was the thin line between collapse and survival. Another column of enemy armor tried to push through the canyon, desperate to crush the resistance. Commanders barked orders, convinced this lone plane could not possibly stop them again. Elias angled downward, his bird screaming as he forced her into another run. The cannon erupted with its terrible song, fire spitting from the nose of the aircraft, tearing through steel like paper. Explosions lit the canyon floor, each blast shaking the ground as tank after tank crumbled. The A-10 shook violently, smoke trailing from its battered fuselage, but it kept flying, kept clawing through the sky like a beast that refused to die. On the command channel, soldiers cheered, their voices trembling with awe. "He's unstoppable. He won't let them through." Even the general stood at the edge of the command tent, eyes fixed on the horizon, a mixture of disbelief and reverence painted across his face. The man who had declared the war lost now saw the truth in front of him, that sometimes history was rewritten not by armies, but by one soul refusing to bow. Missiles streaked upward from the valley floor. Elias jerked the stick, flares spraying across the night sky like falling stars. One missile veered away, exploding harmlessly, but another clipped his right wing. The aircraft bucked, alarms shrieking as fire licked across the fuselage. For a moment, it seemed the Warthog would spiral into the earth. Soldiers gasped, watching their savior engulfed in flame. But then, against all odds, the A-10 leveled out, limping through the chaos, still fighting, still alive. Elias's breathing grew heavier, sweat dripping down his face, his arms aching from the strain. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of smoke, but his voice over the comms was calm, steady, even defiant. "Still with you," he said once more, and the battlefield erupted with cheers. The general's voice came next, thick with emotion, no longer the cold tone of command. "Ward, you've done enough. You've given them hope. Bring her home before you burn with her." But Elias only smiled, eyes fixed on the burning horizon. "Home is up here, General. And I'm not done yet." The enemy forces, rattled and broken, began to pull back. Tanks reversed, artillery units abandoned their positions, soldiers scattering in confusion. They had come believing victory was inevitable. Now they retreated under the shadow of one man's wrath. The tide had turned, not because of overwhelming numbers or superior strategy, but because Elias Ward had refused to let surrender define them. On the ground, young soldiers looked at one another with tears in their eyes. For the first time they believed. They fought harder, surged forward, drove the retreat home. The general barked new orders, but his voice carried something different now, a fire that Elias had lit within him. The battlefield shifted from despair to triumph, and in the midst of it all, the A-10 carved one final circle through the smoke-filled sky. Its engines wheezed, its frame battered, its ammunition nearly spent, but to those below, it looked like a titan, wings stretched wide against the flames. Elias exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. He thought of the faces he'd seen in the trenches, the ones who had looked up at him as though he were more than human. He thought of the generations who would one day ask how the war was saved, and he wondered if they would believe the truth, that it had come down to a forgotten pilot and an aircraft long left for dead. His radio crackled again, voices pleading for him to return. Mechanics scrambled on the airstrip, waving flares, signaling him to bring the Warthog back before it fell apart in the sky. Elias's eyes softened as he gazed down at the flames below, at the soldiers charging forward with fire in their hearts. He had given them everything he had. And yet, he felt the bird still had one more run left in her. "General," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying through every headset, every radio, every heart that listened. "Tell them this. No war is over while there's still one soul willing to fight." With that, he pushed the throttle forward. The A-10's engines screamed in protest, fire trailing behind as it dove one last time into the heart of the enemy retreat. Soldiers below watched in stunned silence, their cheers giving way to tears, knowing they were witnessing something that would be told for centuries. The night sky erupted with fire as Elias tore through the canyon once more, his cannon roaring until the last shell left the barrel. The earth shook with the force of his final strike, tanks exploding in a chain of fury, enemy forces scattering like leaves in a storm. For a heartbeat, silence fell. The battlefield froze. Then from the smoldering wreckage, the A-10 clawed its way back into the sky, limping, burning, but alive. Against all odds, Elias had survived the run. His voice came faint but unbroken through the comms, a whisper that felt like thunder to those who heard it. "I told you. This fight isn't over." And as his battered bird vanished into the night, every soldier below knew that the war had changed forever. They would fight, they would endure, and they would win. Not because of orders, not because of strategy, but because one forgotten pilot had reminded them what it meant to never surrender. The legend of Elias Ward and his war-torn Warthog was born that night, not as a tale of machines or armies, but as proof that courage in the heart of one man could ignite the fire of 1,000.